To save my little brother, I married the most dangerous man alive. She didn't walk into his office looking for love. She walked in with a hospital bill that would bury her, a dying brother she refused to lose, and nothing left to sell except herself. The man across the desk wasn't a banker. He wasn't a lawyer. He was Damien Vescari. And every person in this city with any sense of self-preservation crossed the street when they saw his car coming. Elena Cross had no self-preservation left. She had Milo, and Milo was running out of time. If this story already has you gripping your seat, hit that like button right now, drop your city in the comments below, and let me see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because nothing about what happens next is what you expect. What? The hospital corridor smelled like bleach and bad news. Elena had memorized that smell over the past 6 weeks. The particular bite of industrial disinfectant layered over something underneath it that she refused to name, some biological undercurrent that reminded you, quietly and without apology, that people came here to lose things. She sat in a plastic chair outside room 14C with a folder of paperwork on her lap and a cup of vending machine coffee gone cold in her hand. The fluorescent light above her buzzed with a frequency that had started to feel personal, like it was aimed at her specifically, like the building itself had decided she needed one more small misery to carry. The door to 14C opened and Dr. Okafor stepped out, pulling the door almost shut behind him. He was a careful man, careful with his words, careful with his face, careful in the way people get when they spend years delivering news that breaks other people. He sat down next to Elena without being invited, which told her everything before he said a single word. "The experimental procedure is our best option," he said. "Our only real option, if we're being honest." "We're always being honest," Elena said. "Tell me the number." He told her. She didn't react. She'd already heard it twice from the billing department, once from the insurance company's denial letter, and once from the nonprofit coordinator who'd called to tell her the grant funding had run dry. The number had stopped being a number. It had become something else, a wall, a verdict, a specific and unarguable shape of the word impossible. "There are payment plan options," Dr. Okafor said. He didn't say it with any conviction. "On what income?" Elena asked. "Not bitter, just accurate." He was quiet. "How long does Milo have?" she said, "without the surgery?" Dr. Okafor looked at the folder in her lap instead of at her face. "The progression is unpredictable. Some patients plateau for months. Others—" He stopped. Started again. "We're looking at a window. If we can secure funding and schedule within 8 weeks, his prognosis improves substantially. After that, the procedure becomes more complicated. The outcomes become worse." "Yes." Elena nodded once. She stood up, smoothed the front of her jeans out of habit, and picked up the coffee she wasn't going to drink. "Thank you, doctor." She went into room 14C and closed the door behind her. Milo was 12 years old and looked younger than that in the hospital bed, buried under blankets with a paperback novel open on his chest and his eyes closed. He'd fallen asleep reading again. He did that a lot now. Started things and couldn't finish them. She told herself it was the medication. She told herself a lot of things. She stood in the doorway watching him breathe and felt something shift in her chest. Not breaking. She didn't have time to break. It was more like a hinge swinging open, something that had been locked for a long time coming loose, and on the other side of it was a decision she'd been refusing to look at directly for 2 weeks. She looked at it now. She crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and picked up his novel to mark the page. He stirred, but didn't wake. She put her hand on his and sat there for a long time while the fluorescent light buzzed in the corridor outside and the hospital moved around her with its relentless, indifferent machinery. Then she took out her phone and made the call she'd promised herself she would never make. The number had come from a man named Carver, who worked at the diner near her apartment and had, at some point before the diner, worked for people Elena had spent her life carefully not knowing. He'd given it to her 3 years ago, folded inside a matchbook, with the instruction to use it only if she had absolutely no other option. "You'll know when," Carver had said. "You'll feel it in your stomach." She felt it now. She felt it like a stone. The phone rang twice. A man answered. Not the man she was calling for, Just a voice, flat and professional, like a wall that could speak. "I need to speak with Damien Vescari," Elena said. A pause. "Who's calling?" "Elena Cross." Another pause, longer. "Tell him my father's name was Thomas Cross." She heard the voice repeat her father's name to someone else, muffled. She heard a door close. Then silence for almost a full minute before the voice came back. "Tomorrow, 7 in the evening. I'll text you the address." The line went dead. Elena sat with the phone in her hand and stared at the far wall of Milo's hospital room. Outside the window, the city moved through its night. Sirens, headlights, the muffled sound of traffic 12 stories below. A city that didn't know her name or care about her problem. She looked at her brother. She memorized the way he looked right now, asleep and still small, still salvageable, still here. Then she got up and went home to figure out what to wear to meet a monster. She arrived at the address 10 minutes early because she wasn't the kind of person who arrived late to anything, even disasters. Especially disasters. The building was in a part of the city that the tourist maps had quietly agreed to leave blank, not visibly dangerous, just deliberately unannounced. A converted warehouse with a steel door, and a man outside it who looked at her the way airport security looked at everyone, with practiced suspicion that didn't require a reason. She gave her name. He spoke into an earpiece. The door opened. Inside, it was warmer than she expected, cleaner. She'd been braced for something cinematic, low lighting, smoke, the theatrical brutality of a crime movie set. What she walked into instead looked like an architect's office that had outgrown its ambitions. High ceilings, bare concrete, a long conference table with nobody at it, and at the far end of the room, a man standing with his back to her, looking at something on his phone. He was taller than she'd imagined, broader, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for him specifically, which it probably had. Dark hair. She couldn't see his face yet. "Miss Cross," he said, without turning around. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to take up space. "You're early." "So are you," she said. He turned around. She'd heard the word dangerous used about people before, usually by people who meant something aesthetic by it. A man who drove too fast. A man who said reckless things at dinner parties. She understood now that she had never actually seen the thing the word was pointing at until this moment. Damien Vescari wasn't dangerous because of his size or his reputation or the two armed men stationed near the walls. He was dangerous the way a fault line was dangerous, because the potential was just there, quiet and enormous, and you couldn't look at him without feeling the ground shift slightly beneath your feet. He was also, and this detail landed with a particular cruelty, striking in a way she hadn't prepared for. Dark eyes. A jaw that looked like it had been decided on by committee. A scar running just below his left cheekbone. Not dramatic, just real. A piece of his history written on his face the way all real history eventually gets written. None of that mattered. Elena straightened her spine and walked toward him. "Thank you for seeing me," she said. "I almost didn't." He gestured to a chair. "Sit." She sat. He sat across from her, set his phone face down on the table, and looked at her with an expression that gave her absolutely nothing. "Your father," he said. "Thomas Cross." "Yes." "You know who I am?" "Yes." "And you called anyway." "I have a 12-year-old brother with a condition that requires surgery I can't pay for," Elena said. "I've been through every other option. Banks, nonprofits, medical foundations, every government program that exists, and a few that don't exist yet. I've sold everything I own worth selling. I've borrowed every dollar anyone would lend me. I'm not here because I want to be." She held his gaze. "I'm here because Milo is going to die if I don't find another way." Damien said nothing. His face said nothing. He just looked at her, and she had the unsettling sense that he was reading something she hadn't written, some text underneath what she was saying, something in the space between her words. "What are you asking me for?" he said finally. "Money," Elena said. "A loan, or a gift, or whatever you call it. I don't have collateral, and I can't offer you a standard return, so I'm prepared to negotiate terms that—" "I don't do loans," Damien said. The floor tilted slightly. Elena kept her face still. "Then what do you do?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she became aware of the two men near the walls again, aware of the distance between herself and the door, aware of all the things that could go wrong in a room like this with a man like this, and aware, with a particular clarity, that she'd walked in here anyway. "I have a proposition," Damien said. "It isn't what you came here expecting. You can say no and walk out of here and nothing will happen to you. I want to be clear about that before I tell you what it is." "Tell me." "I need a wife," he said. "Specifically, I need a marriage that is legitimate, verifiable, and lasting. There are reasons for this that are operational and that I'm not going to explain to you tonight." He leaned back slightly, though his posture didn't change, still contained, still controlled. "In exchange for a legal marriage, I will cover every cost associated with your brother's surgery and recovery. Every bill, every specialist, every medication, for as long as he needs it." Elena stared at him. "That's the proposal," Damien said. "There are no romantic expectations. There are no physical demands. You would live in my estate, you would appear with me at certain events, and you would conduct yourself in a way that doesn't compromise either of our reputations. Beyond that, I have no interest in controlling your life." "Why?" Elena said. "Why what? Why me?" It wasn't really a question about her specifically. It was a question about the architecture of the whole thing. Why this? Why now? Why a dying boy's sister? You could find someone else. You could pay someone. You could... "I don't want someone else," Damien said. "I want you." The flatness with which he said it made it worse somehow. Not desire, not possession, just a fact, delivered like a coordinate on a map. "This is where we are. This is what's required." Elena looked down at her hands. They were folded on the table in front of her, still and deliberate, and she noticed they weren't shaking, which surprised her. She thought they should be shaking. "I need to think," she said. "You have until Friday." She stood. He stood. Neither of them extended a hand. "Ms. Cross," he said as she turned toward the door. She turned back. "Your brother's name is Milo," he said. "He's 12. He likes science fiction. He's been in room 14C at St. Aubry's for 6 weeks. He paused. "I already know about your situation. I've known for a while." The ground shifted again, harder this time. "Why?" she said. And this time it was absolutely a question. Damien's expression didn't change. "Friday," he said. She walked out. She didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table in her apartment with a yellow legal pad in front of her and wrote 2 columns, pros and cons, the way her mother used to do when the family had decisions to make, back when her family had still existed as a complete thing, before the accident, before the years of just Elena and Milo, against a world that kept presenting them with smaller and smaller options. The pros column had 1 item. Milo lives. The cons column ran off the bottom of the page. She stared at both columns for a long time. Then she flipped the legal pad over, because she already knew what she was going to do. Had known since she'd heard the surgery number from Dr. Okafor. Had known, maybe, since Carver had given her that matchbook 3 years ago and told her she'd feel it in her stomach. She felt it in her stomach. She picked up her phone and called Dr. Okafor's after-hours line and left a message telling him to prepare for funding to arrive within the week. Then she lay down on her couch and stared at the ceiling and thought about her father's name coming out of her own mouth in that room, and the way Damien Vescari's eyes had changed for just a fraction of a second, not much, barely anything, when she'd said it. She thought about that fraction of a second for a long time. She called back the next morning, not Friday, and said yes before whoever answered could say anything else. There was a pause on the other end, a surprise maybe, or something else she couldn't identify. And then she was given an appointment time and an address for a lawyer's office, and that was that. The paperwork was thorough, impersonal and comprehensive the way all serious legal documents are. Language designed not to feel like anything, to strip the human texture out of every commitment it encoded. She read every line. She asked 3 questions, all of which the lawyer answered without hesitation, which told her the lawyer had answered them before. She signed where she was told to sign. Damien sat across the table from her the entire time, watching her read with an expression she couldn't decode, not impatience, not eagerness. Something watchful, something she didn't have a word for yet. When she signed the last page, he said, "My driver will take you to the estate this evening. Bring what you need." "Everything I need fits in 2 bags," Elena said. Something moved across his face, too fast to catch. "Then bring 2 bags," he said. "Osep." The Viscari estate was north of the city, set back from the road behind iron gates and a quarter-mile of manicured grounds that had the look of something that had been managing its own grandeur for several generations. The house itself was a Georgian-style structure, 3 stories, sand-colored stone, tall windows with dark frames that reflected the evening sky like mirrors. It was beautiful in the cold, structural way that things are beautiful when beauty was never the point of them. A man named Wren met her at the car. Late 40s, compact, the kind of face that had stopped registering its own exhaustion decades ago. He introduced himself as the house manager. He showed her to a suite on the 2nd floor that was larger than her entire apartment, told her dinner was at 8 if she wanted it, and she wasn't required to if she didn't, and left her alone. She stood in the center of the room with her 2 bags at her feet and listened to the quiet. It was a particular kind of quiet she hadn't heard in years, the kind that came from space and stone and distance from other lives. In her apartment, you could always hear the neighbors. Here, she could hear nothing but her own breathing. She unpacked. She unpacked the way she did everything. Deliberately, practically, putting things where they'd be easy to find and get back out again if she needed to move fast. Old habit. She'd moved a lot, the years after her parents disappeared. Learned not to get attached to arrangements. She was putting her last book on the nightstand when she found it. A single sheet of paper on the desk, placed where she'd be certain to see it, handwritten in a cramped and angular hand. The house has 22 rooms. You have access to all of them. The library is on the ground floor east wing. The gym is in the basement. There is a garden on the north side. You may go anywhere you want. You may not leave the property without telling Wren first. This is non-negotiable. No signature. Elena read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her bag. Not because she'd need it again, because she was starting a file. The first week passed in a sequence of awkward geometries. She and Damien occupied the same house the way 2 unfamiliar weather systems occupied the same sky. Aware of each other's presence, occasionally making contact at edges, mostly maintaining a cautious and unexplained distance. They ate dinner together 4 times. The first dinner was almost entirely silent. The second dinner, Damien asked her about Milo's condition. Clinical questions, specific, like he was doing research. She answered them, and he listened the way he seemed to do everything, completely, without fidgeting, without filler, with a quality of attention that was slightly unsettling because most people didn't actually listen like that. By the 3rd dinner, they'd gotten to something that wasn't quite conversation, but was at least consecutive sentences. By the 4th, she'd caught herself thinking of something during the day, an article she'd read, an observation about the house, and storing it away to mention at dinner, and the realization that she'd done that landed in her chest with a complicated weight she didn't examine. He was not what she'd expected. She'd expected a man who controlled everything because he needed to. The psychological profile of a certain kind of power, all rigidity and performance. What she found instead was a man who was controlled because chaos cost too much. There was a difference. She wasn't sure yet what the difference meant. He also said exactly what he meant. Always. Without decoration, without softening, without the social lubricant that most people deployed automatically. It was disorienting. She found herself, after years of reading subtext in every conversation, not knowing what to do with a man who apparently had no subtext. 12 days in, she found the first piece of something wrong. She hadn't been snooping, not exactly. She'd been looking for a specific book she'd seen on a shelf in the library, a history of criminal cartography that she'd been halfway through before Milo's diagnosis had derailed everything. She'd been looking for it on the lower shelves, crouched down with her back to the room, when she heard Damien's voice from the adjoining study. The door was ajar. She wasn't trying to listen, but his voice carried, and she didn't move. Confirmed at both entry points, he was saying. Low and controlled, but with a tension underneath it she hadn't heard before. Nobody moves until I say so, not a step. A pause. I know what Silas thinks. Tell Silas I'll call him when I want his opinion. Another pause. She doesn't need to know yet. She didn't move. She waited until she heard the study door close, and then she stood up slowly, and she didn't have the book she'd come for. She didn't know yet who Silas was. She didn't know what the 2 entry points meant. She didn't know what she wasn't supposed to know yet, or why that particular phrase, yet, made the hair on her arms stand straight up. But she started paying attention differently from that point on. The way you pay attention when you understand that the thing you're inside of is bigger than what you were shown. 2 days later, the first attack happened. She was in the car on the way to the hospital for Milo's pre-surgery assessment, a routine trip, Damien's driver at the wheel, one of his men in the passenger seat. They were crossing the elevated highway interchange on the north end of the city when she heard a sound she didn't immediately identify, a sharp, flat crack that seemed to come from the air itself. And then the rear window splintered and the car lurched sideways as the driver made a decision faster than she could process what was happening. "Down," the man in the passenger seat said, and his voice was so flat and immediate that she was already moving before she understood why. She dropped below the seat line. The car accelerated. She heard 2 more of those flat cracks and then tires, and then the highway interchange dropping behind them at a speed that pressed her into the footwell. 30 seconds. 40. Then the car leveled out, and the driver said something into his earpiece and clipped sentences she couldn't make out, and the man in the passenger seat turned around and looked at her with the same professional emptiness he always wore. "You're okay," he said. She was not shaking. She noticed this again the way she'd noticed it in Viscari's office, the same absence of trembling that she couldn't fully explain and didn't quite trust. "Was that a gun?" she said. "Yes." "Who?" "We don't know yet." She looked at the splintered rear window for a long time. Then she sat up and straightened her jacket. "I still need to make the appointment," she said. The man in the passenger seat stared at her, then he turned back around. They went to the hospital. That night she found Damien in the study. The door opened this time, deliberately, she thought. He was on the phone again, but he ended the call when she appeared in the doorway. "You were told," Elena said. "I was told." "And?" "And we're investigating." His voice was careful, measured in a way that was slightly different from his usual stillness, like the stillness was working harder than usual. "You said this marriage was operational," Elena said. "That it served a purpose I didn't need to know. That was the implication." She held the doorframe. "I think I need to know now." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on his desk cast everything in a warm light that seemed wrong for the conversation. "Not yet," he said. There was that word again. "Someone shot at me today," Elena said. "I have a 12-year-old brother in a hospital bed. I have signed a legal document binding myself to a man I've known for less than 2 weeks. You will understand," she said, "that 'not yet' is a difficult answer." "I understand," Damien said. "I'm asking you to hold it for a little longer." She looked at him. He looked back. Something passed between them in that exchange that she didn't have vocabulary for. Not trust, not exactly, because trust needed more data than she had, but something, an acknowledgement, a thread. "The window in the car needs to be replaced," she said. "It's already handled." "Okay?" She pushed off from the doorframe. "Milo's surgery is scheduled for next Thursday. I need to be there." "You will be," he said. She left him in the lamplight, and she went back to her room and sat on the bed and thought about what she knew and what she didn't know, and the very specific quality of a man who said "not yet" instead of "never," because never was a door closing. Not yet was a door left open. And she was starting to understand slowly, with the careful and unwilling intelligence she'd developed over years of surviving things, that this man, cold and armed and incomprehensible, might actually be trying to keep that door open. The question was why. The question was what was on the other side. She opened her nightstand drawer and took out the folded note he'd left on the first night. She read it again. 22 rooms, free access, 1 non-negotiable rule. She thought about the library, the adjacent study, the conversation she'd overheard. She thought about her father's name in her own mouth and the fraction of a second in Damien's eyes when she'd said it. She put the note back in the drawer and lay down in the dark. She told herself she'd sleep. She didn't sleep. Because somewhere between the highway and the hospital and the lamplight in the study, a question had planted itself in her chest that she couldn't dislodge. If the sniper's bullet had been aimed at Damien, why had it come so close to her? She lay awake for 3 hours after that thought arrived and wouldn't leave. If the bullet had been aimed at Damien, it would have come through the driver's side. The trajectory through the rear window, splintered from the upper right corner inward, put the origin point somewhere elevated, somewhere along the overpass's eastern pedestrian walkway. She'd reconstructed it without meaning to, the way she reconstructed everything uncomfortable, by refusing to look away from it until it made a shape she could hold. The shot had been aimed at the passenger seat, her seat. She got up at 2 in the morning, went to the kitchen, and made coffee she didn't drink. She stood at the kitchen window with the mug warm in both hands and watched the grounds in the dark. The manicured lawn, silver gray under the night sky. The iron fence at the perimeter. The motionless shape of a guard making a slow circuit along the tree line. Security she'd barely noticed before. She noticed it now. She went back to bed at 4. She was dressed and in the library by 6. Chug. She told herself she was looking for information the way a reasonable person looks for information. Carefully, methodically, with a clear sense of what she was entitled to and what she wasn't. She told herself she wasn't snooping, she was assessing. There was a distinction. She wasn't entirely sure it held. The library had 4 walls of floor-to-ceiling shelves and a central table that looked like it had been used for serious work for a long time. The wood worn at the edges, ringed with old cup stains, one corner slightly warped. The books were organized by subject in a system that wasn't alphabetical and wasn't chronological, and took her 20 minutes to decode before she understood that it was organized by acquisition, oldest to newest, left to right, top to bottom. Someone had been building this library for decades, someone who kept everything. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was looking for the shape of the man she'd married, the outline of him, the history, the things that would make the present make sense. She pulled books at random, checked the flyleaves for inscriptions, replaced them. She found nothing for a while, and then she found something. A leather journal tucked horizontally behind a row of economics texts on the 3rd shelf, almost invisible, the kind of hiding that wasn't quite hiding, the kind that counted on nobody being curious enough to look at the right angle. She opened it. The handwriting inside wasn't Damien's, and she'd seen enough of his angular hand from the note to know it. This was different, rounder, faster, the letters slanting rightward like they were always in a hurry. The date started 11 years ago. The entries were short, not personal in the confessional sense, more like operational notes, reminders to a future self, fragments of thought without the connective tissue that would have made them coherent to anyone who didn't already know the context. She read forward 3 pages before she hit a name that stopped her cold. Thomas Cross. Her father's name, in handwriting that wasn't Damien's, in a journal that was 11 years old and had been hidden inside a library she was now living in. She read the entry 3 times. It didn't say much. It said enough. It said, and she had to work for the meaning because the language was compressed and coded in a way that assumed a reader who already knew the players. It said that Thomas Cross had handed off something, some material, some category of information that the writer referred to only as the file, and that the handoff had been clean and the location was secured, and that Damien needed to know that this was the last communication before silence. Below that, 2 words. He knows. Below that, nothing. The next pages were blank. Elena stood with the journal in her hands and felt the room change around her. Not literally. The books were the same, the morning light through the tall windows was the same. But the proportions of everything shifted. The distance between what she'd thought was true and what was apparently true expanding like a room with no walls, and her standing in the middle of it with 11 years of someone else's silence pressing against her from all sides. She put the journal back exactly where she'd found it. She went upstairs. She knocked on the door of Damien's study. "Come in," he said. She opened the door. He was already at his desk, suited, looking like he'd been working for hours, which he probably had. He looked up at her and something passed behind his eyes. Not surprise exactly. more like a recalculation. "Sit down," he said. "I'll stand." She kept her voice level. "Tell me about my father." The room went quiet in a specific way. Not empty quiet, full quiet. The kind that happened when a subject arrived that had weight to it. Damien set down his pen. He looked at her, that complete, unflinching attention. Then he said, "Who told you?" "Nobody told me," Elena said. "I'm telling you. I found the journal. I know my father was connected to your organization." She watched his face. "I know he gave someone something called the file. I know there was a last communication before silence. I know someone in that journal was afraid of who knew what." She breathed. "I have lived my entire adult life believing my parents disappeared in an accident. I need you to tell me right now if that's true." Damien was quiet for a long time. "Sit down," he said again. Differently this time. Not an instruction, almost a request. She sat. He stood, which she hadn't expected, moved to the window the way people moved when they needed to organize something inside themselves before it came out. He stood with his back to her for a moment, and she watched the set of his shoulders and knew with the instinct that had kept her alive through worse years than this, that whatever he was about to say was true, that whatever it cost him to say it, he was going to say it anyway. "Your father worked for me," Damien said, "voluntarily for 4 years. He came to me." He paused. "He was investigating a network, financial, political, criminal, layers. The kind of structure that exists specifically to be invisible. He had evidence, genuine evidence, the kind that would have destroyed people who had spent decades making sure they couldn't be destroyed." He turned around. "He trusted me to protect it." Elena said nothing. "He disappeared 18 months after we made contact," Damien said. "Him and your mother both. It was made to look like a car accident. I know it wasn't because I spent 2 years and a considerable amount of money trying to find out what actually happened, and what I found was enough to tell me that someone with access inside my organization had sold your parents out." The word landed in Elena's chest like something thrown hard. "Someone in your organization," she said. "Yes." "And you didn't know who?" "Not then. Not for certain. I have theories now." His jaw tightened, barely perceptibly. "I arranged the marriage because having you inside this house is the safest place for you to be while I finish what your father started. Because you are a loose end to the people who killed him. Because they know you exist and they don't know how much you know. And that uncertainty makes you a target." Elena looked at her hands. They were folded in her lap the way they'd been folded on the table in his office the first night. Still, deliberate, not shaking. "You used me," she said. "I protected you," he said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" It wasn't a question. "Elena." First time he'd used her first name. It arrived with an impact she wasn't expecting. "If I'd told you any of this in that first meeting, you wouldn't have come. You would have taken Milo and run, and they would have found you within the week." She looked up at him. He was still standing at the window, still contained, but something had shifted in his bearing. A slight opening, like a door moved an inch off its frame. She'd seen it before in people who were telling the truth about something that cost them. "Who is Silas?" she said. The door moved another inch. "My consigliere. He's been with me since before I ran anything. And you trust him." A beat, just one. "I trusted him." She filed that. "The shot yesterday," she said. "It was aimed at me." "Yes." "You knew." "I suspected. I'm confirming it now from the trajectory report." He moved back to his desk, sat down. "Elena, I need you to understand something. You are safer in this house than anywhere in this city. That is not comfort. That is information. I need you to operate on it." "What does that mean practically?" "It means you don't go anywhere without telling Ren. It means you don't take calls from numbers you don't recognize. It means if something feels wrong, you come to me immediately, not in the morning, not when it's convenient." His eyes held hers. "It means you trust me enough to move when I tell you to move." "I don't know if I trust you," Elena said. "I know," he said. "I'm asking you to act like you do until you actually do." She stood up. Her legs felt strange, not weak, just different, like the floor was a slightly different surface than it had been when she sat down. "Milo's surgery is Thursday," she said. "I'll drive you myself." She stopped, looked at him. "You don't need to—" "I'll drive you myself," he said again. She left the study. She stood in the hallway outside it for a full 30 seconds, one hand on the wall, not because she needed the support, but because she needed the pause. Because the thing pressing against her chest was too complicated to carry at a normal pace. Her father had known this man, had trusted this man, had apparently believed this man was worth trusting with something that had eventually gotten him killed. She thought about what that said about her father. She thought about what it said about her. The surgery was on a Thursday morning in October. Gray sky, light rain. Damien drove. He did it the way he did most things, without comment, without explanation, with a focused and unhurried competence that she'd started to identify as his fundamental mode. He didn't try to fill the drive with conversation. He didn't ask her how she was feeling. He just drove, and she sat in the passenger seat and watched the city pass, and thought about her brother's face the night before when she'd told him it was finally happening. Milo had said, "Am I going to be okay?" She'd said, "Yes." He'd said, "How do you know?" She'd said, "Because I said so." And he'd made the face he'd been making since he was 4 years old, the one that meant he thought she was full of it but loved her anyway. And she'd held his hand until he fell asleep, and then she'd sat in the chair by his bed until the nurses changed shift, and then she'd gone to the waiting area and cried for approximately 8 minutes, which was the amount of time she'd decided she was allowed. Then she'd come home. Then Damien had knocked on her door, just once, quiet, and said, "We leave at 6." And she'd said okay through the door. Now they were in the car in the rain, and Milo's surgery was in 2 hours, and she was married to a man she didn't understand who had known her father and who she was fairly certain, with the uncertain and evidence-like conviction of someone operating on instinct rather than proof, was not actually a monster. What he was exactly, she still didn't know. "Thank you," she said. "For the drive, for the surgery, for all of it." She didn't specify. He didn't say you're welcome. He said, "He's going to be fine." She looked at him. His eyes were on the road. "He is," he said again. She turned back to the window. "Yeah," she said. "He is, Ma." The surgery took 7 hours. She sat in the waiting room through all of it, moving from chair to chair with the restlessness of someone whose body understood that sitting still was a kind of defeat. She drank coffee from a machine and then stopped drinking coffee because her hands started doing something adjacent to shaking, not quite, but close enough to make her put the cup down. She read half of a magazine she had no interest in and couldn't tell you afterward what it was about. Damien stayed. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected him to drop her at the entrance, maybe check in at intervals, manage her from a distance the way he managed everything. Instead, he sat in the waiting room and worked, phone and a thin laptop, without speaking to her unless she spoke to him, which she found, to her own surprise, not oppressive, but necessary. His presence was like ballast, something heavy and stable in the room that kept the floor from listing. 3 hours in, she sat down next to him and said, "Tell me something." He looked up. "Not about any of this," she said. "Something else. Anything." He closed the laptop. He thought for a moment, actually thought she could see it, the same way he listened, all the way through. Then he said, "When I was 8 years old, I stole a dog." She looked at him. "From a neighbor," he said. "He wasn't treating it well. I took it in the middle of the night and hid it for 6 days in a maintenance shed before my father found it." A pause. "My father made me return it." "And then?" "And then 3 days later the dog disappeared from the neighbor's yard and reappeared in the shed." "You stole it again." "I did." "What happened?" "My father found it again." A beat. "He didn't make me return it the second time." Elena looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "What was the dog's name?" "Doesn't matter," Damien said. But something around the corners of his mouth had changed. Not a smile, not quite, but the muscular precondition of one. "It matters," she said. "Biscuit," he said. She laughed. It came out of her completely unexpected, short and real, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth immediately, but it was too late. It had already happened. Damien looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Open, briefly, in a way that the usual stillness covered like a shutter, but the shutter was a second too slow. Then Dr. Okafor came through the double doors, and they both stood up. "Surgery went well," the doctor said, and Elena's knees did the thing they'd been refusing to do all day. Not buckling, just softening, just briefly admitting that they'd been working very hard against gravity for a very long time. She put her hand on the back of the nearest chair. Damien's hand was at her elbow. She wasn't sure when it got there. She didn't move away from it. Milo woke up groggy and confused and immediately asked if anyone had fed his fish while he was in surgery, which told Elena his brain was intact in every way that mattered. She sat on the edge of his bed and told him his fish were fine, and the surgery had worked and he was going to be okay. And he looked at her with the particular directness of 12-year-olds who haven't learned yet to avoid the emotional center of things. "Who's that?" he said, looking past her. She turned. Damien was standing in the doorway, exactly as he'd stood on the first night she'd seen him, contained, watching, giving the room space. "That's Damien," Elena said. "Is he the one who paid for the surgery?" "Yes." Milo considered this with the gravity of a boy who had spent 6 weeks in a hospital and had, in that time, apparently developed opinions about the nature of debt and obligation. "Why?" he said. "It's complicated," Elena said. "Is he your boyfriend?" Milo, "Because you look at him weird." "I'm going to need you to stop talking," Elena said. Milo looked at Damien. "She always says that when she doesn't want to answer," he told him. Damien looked at Milo. The expression on his face was the one she hadn't been able to read until this moment. And reading it now was like reading a language she hadn't known she'd already learned. It wasn't control, it wasn't calculation, it was something raw and brief and undefended, there and gone in a second. It was grief. She filed that too, under the folder she was building in her chest, things about this man that didn't fit the story she'd been told about him, things that were adding up to a different story, one she wasn't ready to name yet. She left Damien with Milo for 20 minutes while she talked to the nursing staff about discharge protocols. When she came back, Milo was explaining the plot of his current novel with the manic enthusiasm of someone who'd been sedated for 7 hours and had a lot of energy to reclaim. Damien was listening. Actually, listening. She stood in the doorway and watched for a moment, and something moved in her chest that she didn't try to name. They'd been back at the estate for 4 days when the housekeeper tried to kill her. She wouldn't have called it that immediately, tried to kill her, because the immediate experience of it was so mundane. Morning tea, the way every morning for 3 weeks had started, brought up by a woman named Mrs. Harlan who was 50-ish and quiet, and had always nodded pleasantly when Elena passed her in the hallways. The tea arrived on a tray. Elena drank half the cup before she noticed the taste was slightly off. Not wrong enough to be alarming, just slightly different from usual. A bitterness underneath the bergamot that she might not have caught if she hadn't spent 3 weeks noticing everything. She put the cup down. She sat still for a moment. Then, because she was the kind of person who didn't wait for someone else to assess her own situation, she went to the bathroom, did what needed to be done with the deliberate practicality of someone prioritizing function over dignity, and then sat on the bathroom floor with her back against the tub and texted Damien, "T, Mrs. Harlan, don't let her leave the property." 30 seconds later, her phone rang, his voice controlled and fast. "Are you throwing up?" "I already did," she said. "Preemptive." "Smart." She could hear him moving. "How do you feel?" "Not great." Not a lie. "Damien, how long has she worked here?" A pause. 12 years. "Is she connected to anyone?" Another pause. This one longer. "I'm going to find out in the next 20 minutes. Can you get up?" She assessed. "Yes." "Go lie down. Ren is coming to you." "I need to know what was in the tea." "Elena, go lie down." "I need—" "Please." The word arriving differently than anything else she'd heard from him. Stripped down. No maintenance on it. "Please go lie down." She went and lay down. Ren arrived, then the estate's physician, then later in the afternoon, a man she'd seen twice before who worked in some capacity adjacent to Damien's security and who had the look of someone who'd spent time extracting information from people who didn't want to give it. He didn't speak to her. He went to a room she'd never been in on the first floor, and she didn't ask what happened in it. What she knew by evening, Mrs. Harlan had been receiving payments from an external account for 4 months. The tea had contained a compound that, at a full cup, would have produced a cardiac event that could plausibly be attributed to stress in a 26-year-old with an already compromised system. "It was good work," the physician said, in the flat professional tone of someone discussing craft divorced from its application. Elena sat with that for a long time. Someone had been inside this house, had been inside it for months, hiding in the geometry of the ordinary. Morning tea, pleasant nods in corridors, 12 years of accumulated trust. Someone had planned for her specifically, which meant someone had known she was coming before she'd arrived. She found Damien in the study that night. He was standing at the window again. She was starting to understand that was what he did when something had gotten through the control. Put himself at the window where he could see the perimeter and think. "She was hired before the marriage," Elena said from the doorway. He turned. "Yes. Which means whoever is doing this knew about the marriage before it happened." "Yes. Which means it was someone close to you." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was in the set of his jaw, that barely perceptible tightening she'd learned to read the way she'd learned to read everything about him, slowly, carefully, without looking directly at it. "Silas," she said. The silence that followed that word was the loudest thing she'd heard in weeks. "I don't have proof," Damien said finally. But, he turned back to the window. But, Elena leaned against the door frame. Her stomach still felt wrong. Not dangerously wrong, just wrong. The body's reliable record-keeping of events that had tried to harm it. "If it's Silas," she said, "then he's known everything from the beginning. He knew about my father. He knew about the file. He knew about the marriage." She paused. "He's been inside every decision you've made for years." "I know." "Damien." She waited until he turned around. "Who wrote the journal in the library?" Something happened in his face, not collapse. He wasn't a man who collapsed, but a kind of opening that was almost the same thing. "Your father," he said. "He left it here. With me. For safekeeping." She stood with that. "He trusted you," she said. "He trusted me with everything that mattered," Damien said, "and I failed him." The room was very quiet. "You didn't fail him," Elena said. "Someone betrayed you both." She pushed off the door frame. "There's a difference," she said. His words from 3 days ago returned to him. "Find me the proof." She didn't have to look for it. It found her. 6 days after the poisoned tea, 3 days after a warehouse explosion across the city that Wren told her obliquely had destroyed a significant piece of Damien's financial infrastructure, Elena was in the library when she noticed the book she'd originally come looking for on that first morning, the criminal cartography history, had been moved. She'd replaced it exactly, and she knew exactly how she'd placed it, and it was slightly different now. An inch to the left. A small thing. The kind of thing that wouldn't register if you weren't paying the specific quality of attention she'd been paying to everything in this house since the first week. She pulled it. Behind it, where there had been nothing, there was a flash drive. She held it in her palm. It was small and unexceptional, the generic black rectangle of something you'd buy in a gas station. She turned it over. On the back, in permanent marker, in handwriting she now recognized, a single symbol she couldn't read, and below it, her name. Her name. In her father's hand. She stood in the library with the flash drive in her palm and felt the floor shift under her one more time, the walls of the room expanding into that familiar geometry of a world bigger than what she'd been shown. And this time she didn't wait for Damien. She went upstairs, she opened her laptop, and she plugged in the drive. It contained one folder. The folder contained one file. The file opened into a document so dense with names and dates and financial trails and recorded communications that she scrolled for 3 minutes before she got to the bottom and sat back and understood, in the way you understand something that restructures everything you thought you knew about the architecture of the world, what her father had actually been doing, what he'd actually found, what he'd died trying to make sure didn't die with him. And in the second to last page of the file, cross-referenced against a payment ledger and a phone record from 11 years ago, was a name she now knew: Silas Moretti. Not a theory, not a suspicion, a transaction, a date, an account number. And beside it, in her father's careful, rushing handwriting, the order to disappear us came from here. She was still staring at the screen when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered because she'd stopped operating on normal caution parameters 3 poison teas ago. "Ms. Cross," said a voice she didn't know. Smooth, educated, with an accent she couldn't quite place, somewhere between cultivated and deliberately obscured. "I think it's time we spoke directly." "Who is this?" she said. "My name is Victor Salazar." A pause, perfectly timed. "And I have your brother." The room went cold. "Milo was discharged yesterday," she said. Her voice came out steady, and she would not, later, be able to fully explain how. "Milo was discharged yesterday," Victor agreed. "And then he was collected. He's comfortable, he's unharmed. And he will remain both of those things as long as you make the right choice in the next 48 hours. Elena looked at the laptop screen, at her father's name, at Silas Moretti's name, at the document that could destroy half the city's power structure. "What choice?" she said. "A simple one," Victor said. "You have a flash drive. I want it. And I want you to bring me Damien Vescari." The silence stretched out between them across whatever distance separated them, and in that silence Elena understood, with the crystalline and terrible clarity of someone who has just been handed an impossible equation, that she was no longer a woman who'd signed a contract to save her brother. She was the pivot point. She was the thing the whole structure turned on. And Milo, 12 years old, still recovering, still small, was in the hands of a man she'd never heard of until 30 seconds ago, in a location she didn't know, and the only currency she had to buy him back was the man sleeping 2 floors above her who had promised her father, apparently, that he would keep her safe. Her phone in one hand, the flash drive still warm from her palm in the other, the laptop screen glowing with her dead father's evidence in front of her. She had 48 hours. She didn't move for 40 seconds. She counted them, not deliberately. Her brain just started counting the way it defaulted to measurable things when the unmeasurable was pressing in from all sides. 40 seconds of sitting in the library chair with the phone gone silent in her hand, and the laptop screen burning her father's evidence into her vision, and the flash drive still warm against her palm. Then she put the flash drive in her pocket. She closed the laptop. She stood up. She went upstairs and knocked on Damien's door. He opened it fast. He was still dressed, which meant he hadn't been sleeping, which meant he'd been waiting for something. And the fact that he'd been waiting for something at 2 a.m. sent its own signal through her chest that she didn't stop to examine. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him step back from the door without speaking. She walked in. She sat in the chair by his desk. He stood. "Victor Salazar," she said. "Tell me who he is." The name landed in the room like a stone in still water, the ripple of it moving across Damien's face in a way she'd never seen before. Not fear. Damien. Vescari wasn't a man who feared things the way ordinary people feared them, but something adjacent to it, something older and more complicated than fear. "Where did you hear that name?" he said. "He called me." She watched his eyes. "He has Milo." The stillness that followed was different from his usual stillness. This one had edges. "When?" 20 minutes ago. "He wants the flash drive and he wants you. He gave me 48 hours. Damien turned away from her, moved to the window. That window, the perimeter window, the one he went to when something had gotten through. He stood with his back to her, and she watched the tension move through his shoulders like a current. "Salazar runs the Western Syndicate," he said. "We've been in a Cold War for 4 years. He's been waiting for a position of leverage." A pause. "He found one." "He knew about Milo," Elena said. "He knew about the surgery, the discharge, everything, which means—" "Silas," Damien said, the word coming out flat and final, like a door closing. "I found the flash drive," Elena said, "in the library, behind the cartography book." She saw his shoulders change. My father left it. It has everything. The financial network, the political connections, the phone records, and Silas Moretti's name on a payment ledger from 11 years ago with a notation that reads, "The order to disappear us came from here." Damien didn't turn around for a long moment. When he did, his face was the most unguarded she'd ever seen it. Not broken, he wasn't a man who broke, but stripped back to something underneath the architecture of control, something that had been carrying a very specific weight for a very long time. "Your father hid it here," Damien said, knowing I'd never look behind that specific book because I don't read cartography. Something moved behind his eyes. "He knew this house better than I do." "He trusted you with the location," Elena said, "even if you didn't know it." "He trusted me with everything," Damien said, "and I missed it for 11 years. "Stop," she said, not unkindly. "We don't have time for that right now." He looked at her, and she held his gaze, and something passed between them in that exchange that was different from every previous exchange. Not the careful negotiation of two people who didn't know each other yet. Not the cautious threading of information back and forth. Something direct. Something that had stopped asking permission. "Victor said bring you to him," Elena said. "He said bring him the drive and bring you." "He wants to eliminate the evidence and the threat in one transaction," Damien said. "Efficient." "What do I do?" Elena said. He sat down across from her. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment, thinking, actually thinking, in the way she'd learned meant he was building something from the ground up rather than retrieving a prepared answer. Then he looked up. "You call him back," Damien said. "You tell him you'll deliver both." The room went very quiet. "And then?" she said. "And then we don't." She didn't sleep. Neither did he. They worked through what remained of the night in the study with the door closed and Wren stationed outside it, building the architecture of something that required absolute precision because the margin for error was Milo's life. What she learned in those hours, Damien had known for 6 weeks that Silas was compromised. Not proof, not the kind of proof you could act on, but enough to make him move certain things, shift certain structures, quietly reroute certain channels of information in ways that Silas would not notice because they were invisible against the baseline of normal operation. He'd been preparing for a confrontation he couldn't initiate without exposing his hand. The flash drive changed that. "The drive is proof," Damien said. "It's also bait, if we use it correctly. If we let Silas know we have it," Elena said, following the logic. "He moves. He has to. He can't afford to wait. He'll go to Victor. They're already in contact. Salazar wouldn't have Milo otherwise. Silas is the connection. Silas has been the connection." He spread a map across the desk. The waterfront, the warehouse district, the geography of the city's criminal infrastructure rendered in clean lines. Victor will want to move quickly once he knows the drive exists. He'll push for the exchange immediately, which means we know when and we know where. "Where?" Elena said. "Victor always works the waterfront," Damien said. "He owns 3 structures there under shell entities. He'll pick the one with the most exits and the least exposure." His finger moved on the map. "Here. Or here." Elena looked at the map. She thought about Milo in a building somewhere near that water. She thought about her father's handwriting on a flash drive and 11 years of a secret kept in a library no one had thought to search. "What do you need me to do?" she said. "Exactly what Victor asked," Damien said. "Deliver me. Appear to." She looked up from the map. "You want me to actually bring you to him?" "I want you to make him believe you're betraying me," he said. "Which means you need to be convincing. Which means I can't tell you the details," Elena said, understanding arriving ahead of his explanation. "Because if Silas has access to this house, to these conversations, we have to assume he hears everything," Damien said. "We have to assume every communication inside these walls has been monitored." He held her gaze. "Which means from this moment, you and I cannot speak directly about the plan. We have to operate on what we've built tonight, what we agreed to in this room. And if something changes, then you make the call in the moment," he said. "Your judgment." Elena looked at him. "You're trusting my judgment?" I've been trusting your judgment since the first night you walked into my office, he said. You were the only person in this city who came through that door without wanting something I couldn't give. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I want my brother alive. That, he said, I can give. She called Victor back at 6 in the morning. She made her voice tired and slightly frayed, which wasn't entirely performance. She was tired and slightly frayed. She told him she'd thought about his offer. She told him she'd read the drive. She said, with the particular flatness of someone who has run out of options, I'll do it. Tell me where. Victor told her. She wrote it down on a piece of paper, which she showed to Damien once for 3 seconds before burning it in the study's ashtray. The meeting was in 36 hours. Waterfront, exactly as Damien had predicted. The second of the 2 structures he'd pointed to on the map. Then the waiting began, which was its own particular brutality. She spent the first day in the library. Not hiding. She'd stopped doing anything that looked like hiding. But sitting at the central table with a book open in front of her and her mind running the geometry of the next 36 hours in the background, the way a processor ran calculations behind a display. She moved through the scenarios. She found the holes. She filled what she could and flagged what she couldn't and put them in the file she was building in her chest that was getting very heavy. On the afternoon of the first day, Silas Moretti came to the house. She hadn't met him yet. She'd heard his name, she'd seen it on her father's drive, she'd watched it function as a kind of dark gravity in Damien's responses. But she hadn't been in the same room with him, and when he walked into the library and found her there, she had approximately 3 seconds to compose her face into something that didn't reflect what she knew. He was older than she'd expected, mid-60s, with a face that had been handsome once and had settled into a kind of distinguished heaviness, the weight of years and certainty. Silver-haired, well-dressed, the understated dress of someone who'd long since stopped needing to prove anything with clothing. He looked at her with warm and practiced eyes. Mrs. Viscari, he said, the name arriving from his mouth like a gift. I've been meaning to introduce myself properly. Silas Moretti. I know who you are, Elena said. She kept her voice pleasant. He sat down across from her without being invited, the way people sat when they'd been inhabiting spaces so long the formalities had eroded. How are you settling in? This house can be, he paused, selecting, overwhelming at first. I'm adapting, she said. Good. He folded his hands on the table. Old hands, she noticed, steady, the hands of a man who had made irreversible decisions so many times that the weight of them no longer registered physically. Damien he's not an easy man. He wouldn't tell you that himself. I imagine the adjustment has required a certain amount of, Silas, she said, pleasantly. Was there something you needed? Something moved behind his warm eyes. A recalibration. He smiled. Just wanted to meet you properly. You've been through a great deal recently. I have, she agreed. The incident with Mrs. Harlan was unfortunate, he said. These things, sometimes people are not who they appear to be, even after years. He let the sentence sit there. It had more than one meaning, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and they both sat with that for a moment, performing a conversation that was conducting itself on 2 tracks simultaneously. Sometimes, Elena agreed. He stood, smoothed the front of his jacket. Damien is lucky, he said, to have someone so composed. A pause. Your father would have been proud. She looked up at him. His face was still warm, still pleasant, still the face of a man bringing condolences. But underneath the warmth and the specific quality of his attention in that moment, she felt the thing she'd felt standing on the elevated highway interchange in the seconds before the window shattered. The sense of something aimed. He knew she had the drive. She didn't know how he knew. She didn't know when he'd found out. But in the moment he said, your father, she understood that this visit wasn't social, and the warmth wasn't real, and the man standing across the library table from her had known her father's name for 11 years, in a context that had ended with her parents dead on a road that should have been safe. She held his gaze. She kept her face exactly where it was. Thank you, Silas, she said. That means a lot. He left. She sat in the library for 5 minutes after he was gone, very still, breathing carefully, and then she picked up her book and resumed the pretense of reading it because the house had ears, and she had 30 hours left, and she could not afford the luxury of falling apart in the geometry of someone else's surveillance. The 30 hours passed the way bad time always passes. Too fast in some stretches, viscous and resistant in others, the clock running on its own logic that had nothing to do with what she needed. The night before the exchange, she couldn't find Damien. She looked for him at 11, at midnight, at 1 in the morning, moving through the house quietly with the particular anxiety of someone who'd started to use another person as ballast without meaning to. His study was empty. The kitchen was empty. She checked the grounds from the first-floor windows and saw only the guards on their circuit. She found him in the basement gym at 1:30. He was working a heavy bag with the focused intensity of someone engaged in a conversation with themselves that wasn't going well. He'd taken off his jacket and his shirt was damp at the shoulders, and he was hitting the bag with the systematic precision of a man who'd been taught to do this right, and was applying that teaching to something that had nothing to do with technique. He didn't stop when she came in. She sat on a bench against the wall and watched him work. After a few minutes, he stopped. He pressed his forearm against the bag to still it. His breathing was controlled, more controlled than hers would have been, but she could see the effort of the control. "Silas came to see me today," she said. "I know." He picked up a towel from the floor, pressed it against his face. "He knows about the drive." "Yes. He'll go to Victor tonight. Victor will move the exchange earlier." He dropped the towel. "We have less time than we thought." She absorbed that. "How much less?" "Could be tomorrow morning." He turned and looked at her. "Are you ready?" She thought about all the things ready could mean. "I don't know," she said. "Are you?" He crossed to the bench and sat next to her, not close, but present in the way he was always present, full and slightly too still. He was quiet for a moment. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Before tomorrow." She waited. "Your father," he said. In the last communication before he went silent, the last entry in the journal, he didn't just tell me about the file. He looked at his hands. "He told me about you. He said—" He stopped, started again the way people started again when the sentence they're trying to say has more weight than the air around it can support. He said if anything happened to him, and he thought it would, I was to find you, not use you, find you, keep you safe. He paused. He said you were the best thing he'd ever done. The silence afterward was absolute. Elena looked at the far wall. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth and did the thing she'd learned to do in 8 minutes in a hospital waiting room. Compressed everything that needed compressing into a smaller space so the rest of her could keep functioning. He was right about you, she said finally. He knew you'd keep the promise. I took 11 years, Damien said. You kept it, she said. That's what matters. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The basement was quiet around them, the particular quiet of underground spaces, removed from the sounds of the house and the grounds and the city beyond. Then Damien said, Whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know that Milo comes first, not the drive, not Silas, not Victor. If it comes to a choice, you get Milo and you get out. Everything else is secondary. That's not the plan, she said. That's the override, he said. If the plan breaks, that's the override. She looked at him. He looked at her. And something passed between them that was too large and too complicated to be a single thing. Not love, not yet, or not only, but something that had been building in the specific and unlikely chemistry of two people who'd been thrown into the same fire and had, without intending to, started to run toward it together. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. She went back to her room. She lay down. She did not sleep. The call came at 4:17 in the morning. Not Victor, a number she didn't recognize, and then a voice she did because she'd spent 3 weeks listening to it across dinner tables and in doorways and in a basement at 1 in the morning, and hearing it now at 4:17 from an unknown number sent a specific and nauseating signal through her entire nervous system. Silas. Elena, he said, warm, practiced, the performance of concern from a man who had ordered her parents killed. I need you to listen to me very carefully. She sat up. She made her breathing silent. I'm listening. What Damien has told you about tomorrow. It isn't protection. It's a trap. Not for Victor. For you. A pause. perfectly placed. He needs the drive to consolidate power. He needs Victor neutralized. And he needs you to appear to be the betrayer so that when this is over, the liability disappears cleanly. Another pause. You. The room was very cold. What are you saying? She said. I'm saying your husband intends to use you as the fall position, Silas said. If the exchange goes wrong, and exchanges go wrong, you're the one standing between him and Victor with the drive in your hand. You're the one who looks like the architect of the betrayal. You're the one Victor kills. A soft exhalation, the sound of reluctant truth. Your father trusted Damien too. You know how that ended. She sat with the phone against her ear in the dark. Silas, she said carefully, why are you telling me this? Because I knew your father, he said, and I couldn't protect him. Maybe I can protect you. A pause. Come to me. Bring the drive. I can get Milo out without the exchange. I have a channel to Victor that Damien doesn't know about. Silence. Think about it, Silas said. You have 2 hours. The line went dead. Elena sat in the dark with the dead phone in her hand and felt the architecture of everything she'd built over the past weeks tremble at its foundations. Every wall, every conclusion, every thread of trust she'd woven with careful and reluctant hands shaking at the joints. She sat with it for 60 seconds. She let it shake. Then she put the phone down and thought with the cold and surgical focus she'd developed over years of surviving things that were supposed to break her. She thought about what Silas had said. She thought about how he'd said it. She thought about the warmth in the library and the warmth on the phone and the warmth that never quite reached the eyes. And she thought about a man who had been inside Damien Vescari's organization for decades, who had survived by being trusted absolutely, who survived by knowing exactly what each person needed to hear. She thought about her father's handwriting. The order to disappear east came from here. And she thought about one more thing. Silas had known about the drive, had known about it fast enough to come to the library, fast enough to call before dawn, which meant he'd had access to the information almost in real time, which meant he wasn't offering her an alternative to the plan. He was offering her a way to destroy it. She got up. She dressed. She went to Damien's room and knocked twice. Their signal established the previous night in 30 seconds of wordless agreement. He opened the door. He was dressed. He'd been awake. She held up her phone. He looked at it. She pointed at her ear and then shook her head. The room might be listened to. Then she took the notepad from his desk and wrote 3 words. He called me. She watched understanding move across his face. Not surprise. Something worse than surprise. The specific and terrible expression of someone whose worst calculation has just been confirmed. She wrote, "He knows the plan." He took the pen from her. He wrote, "How much?" She wrote, "Everything." He stood up. He moved to the window. She watched him stand there and absorb it, absorb the weight of a betrayal that wasn't new, wasn't a surprise, wasn't even, strictly speaking, news, but that had just become real in a way that plans on paper couldn't make it real. Then he turned around, and his face was something she'd never seen on it before. Resolved in a way that had gone past planning, past strategy, past the careful architecture of calculated risk. Resolved in the way faces got when someone had decided that what came next was going to cost them something, and they'd decided the cost was acceptable. He took the notepad. He wrote something and turned it to face her. It read, "Then we changed the plan. Right now. Tell me everything he said, word for word." She took the notepad back. She wrote, "He said you're going to let Victor kill me. He said you need me to be the fall position. He said come to him and he'll get Milo out through a private channel. He said, I have 2 hours. She watched him read it. She watched something move through him. Not rage, though it was in the neighborhood of rage. Something colder and more deliberate. The thing that lived underneath the controlled surface and only surfaced when the situation had become genuinely irrecoverable by any calm means. He took the notepad. He wrote, "Do you believe him?" She looked at the question for a moment. She thought about all the things she knew and all the things she'd decided, and the weight of the file in her chest and her father's handwriting, and a dog named Biscuit, and 8 minutes in a hospital waiting room, and a man who had driven her to a surgery at 6 in the morning in the rain without being asked. She took the pen. She wrote, "No." Then, below it, "But he's going to move when I don't show up, which means our window just closed." He read it. He looked up at her. She wrote one more line. "So tell me what we do in the next 2 hours instead of the next 36. And don't leave anything out this time." He looked at her for a long moment in the pre-dawn dark of the room, and what she saw on his face was not what she expected. Not calculation, not the controlled efficiency of a man running scenarios. It was something that looked almost like gratitude, unmaintained and briefly visible, the way the door had moved off its frame in the hospital waiting room. Then he sat down at the desk and picked up the pen. And for the next 40 minutes, in silence, in handwriting, in a language of abbreviated notation they invented between them on the fly, they built something new out of the rubble of what Silas Moretti had just destroyed. It was reckless. It was tight. It required her to walk into a building controlled by a man who wanted her dead and perform a betrayal convincing enough to fool someone who had spent decades surviving by reading people while carrying the only evidence that could bring the whole structure down, with her brother's life as the margin of error. It was also, she thought, looking at the finished plan on the notepad, the only thing that had a chance of working. She looked up at Damien. He looked back. She wrote, "I need you to trust me in that building, whatever it looks like, whatever I do." He took the pen. He wrote without hesitating, "I already do." She tore the notepad pages into pieces. She put them in the ashtray. She lit them with the lighter from his desk drawer and watched her father's evidence and Silas Moretti's name, and 40 minutes of desperate planning turned to ash in the gray before dawn light of a room that had just become the last place either of them would feel certain about anything. She picked up her phone. She called Silas back. "I'm coming to you," she said. She drove herself. That was the first deviation from what Silas expected. He'd assumed she'd come with Damien's driver, or alone in one of the estate's cars, traceable and contained. She took the car she'd owned before the marriage, a 7-year-old gray sedan that she'd parked in the estate's secondary garage and hadn't touched in weeks. She left at 5:43 in the morning while the sky was still the color of dirty water and the grounds were at their quietest rotation. She drove with both hands on the wheel and her mind running the plan in a loop. Not because she needed to review it, she had it, every beat of it locked in, but because the loop kept the other thing out. The other thing being the particular quality of terror that lived underneath the functional surface of her, the part that knew, with biological certainty, that she was driving toward a building controlled by a man who had already tried to kill her twice, carrying evidence that could destroy half the city's infrastructure, with her 12-year-old brother somewhere inside. She let the plan run. She kept driving. The waterfront at 6 in the morning was its own kind of desolate. The particular emptiness of industrial spaces between shifts, all concrete and salt air, and the distant mechanical sounds of the port running its permanent overnight operations a half-mile east. The address Silas had given her was a converted storage facility, 3 stories, corrugated steel exterior painted the universal gray of things that didn't want to be noticed. 2 vehicles parked outside. A man at the entrance she didn't recognize. She parked. She sat in the car for 10 seconds, not hesitating, just calibrating. Then she got out. The man at the entrance patted her down with professional efficiency. He found her phone, which she'd expected. He found the flash drive in her jacket pocket, which she'd also expected. She'd put it there deliberately, the real drive, because the plan required her to actually have it. What he didn't find was the secondary device in the lining of her left shoe, because he was thorough but not thorough enough, and because the lining had been Damien's modification, and Damien had spent years knowing exactly how thorough was and what came after it. She was shown inside. Silas was waiting on the second floor in a room that smelled like machine oil and river damp, standing at a window with a coffee cup in his hand, like a man who'd made peace with the hour. He turned when she came in, and his face did the warm thing it always did. The practiced opening, the performance of relief. "Elena." He set the coffee down. "You made the right choice." She looked at the room. 3 other men she didn't know positioned at different points. Not aggressive, just present. the tactical grammar of men who were there to manage outcomes. A table with a laptop. A door to an interior room, closed. "Where's Milo?" she said. "Safe. Close." He gestured to a chair. "Sit down. We have things to discuss before—" "I'm not sitting down," she said. "I want to see my brother." His warm eyes held hers. "Of course, in a moment." A pause, the kind that reorganized the power in the room. "You brought the drive." "I brought it," she said. "And Damien, you told him you were coming to me." "I told him I needed air," she said. "He's at the estate." Something in Silas's expression shifted. A minor recalibration, too small for most people to catch. She caught it. She'd been watching his face for days. "Good," he said. "That's good." He extended his hand. She reached into her jacket and produced the flash drive and placed it in his palm. He looked at it for a moment, then crossed to the laptop on the table and inserted it. She watched him open the file, scroll through the first page, and she watched the particular quality of attention he gave it. Not the attention of a man verifying an unknown document, but the attention of a man confirming something he'd been looking for 11 years. He knew exactly what was on it. He'd been looking for it since her father hid it. "This is everything," he said, satisfied, the satisfaction of a conclusion. "It's everything," Elena agreed. He looked up at her, and something in his face changed then, the warmth reducing slightly, the performance thinning the way performances thinned when the audience had been secured and the actor got tired. What was underneath it was older and harder and not warm at all. "Your father was a thorough man," Silas said. "He was," she said. "It's a shame." He pulled the drive from the laptop. "That thoroughness is what killed him. Some people can't let a thing go when letting go would save everyone a great deal of difficulty." He looked at the drive in his hand. "Including themselves." The room was very still. "He trusted Damien," Elena said. Her voice was level. "That's what you wanted me to believe was his mistake." "It was his mistake," Silas said. "No," she said. "You were his mistake. He trusted Damien, and Damien kept the trust. You were the one who sold him out." She held Silas's gaze. "I know. It's in the file. The payment, the date, the account, his handwriting." She paused. "My father knew it was you." The warmth finished, leaving Silas's face. What remained was the thing she'd felt aimed at her in the library. The specific and impersonal quality of a man who had been making irreversible decisions for so long that the irreversibility had stopped registering as anything exceptional. "You came here knowing," he said. "I came here knowing," she said. "Then you understand," he said carefully, "that the situation has changed." "The situation," said a voice from the closed interior door, "has been changed for about 40 minutes. The door opened. Victor Salazar was shorter than his voice had implied, compact and controlled, with the physical economy of someone who'd learned early that size was a less reliable resource than precision. He was dressed plainly, expensively, the way men dressed when they wanted the money to show without the money trying. He walked into the room with the particular confidence of someone arriving to an outcome they'd already decided. Behind him, in the doorway, was Milo. Elena's chest did the thing chess did when relief and terror arrived simultaneously. A compression, a loosening, the body unable to decide between them. Milo was upright. He looked exhausted and pale and furious in the way 12-year-olds got furious, with the full moral conviction of someone who'd just had a very bad night and intended to have words about it. He had a bruise along his left jaw that she was going to deal with later, and his hospital bracelet was still on his wrist. He met her eyes across the room. She gave him the smallest possible shake of her head. He pressed his mouth together and stayed where he was. "Miss Cross," Victor said, "or Mrs. Viscari, I've been looking forward to this." "The feeling isn't mutual," Elena said. He smiled. It was a real smile, which was somehow worse than a fake one. "You have something I want, and I have something you want. Silas has handled the drive, which simplifies the transaction." He looked at Silas. "Destroy it." Silas moved to the laptop. "Wait," Elena said. Victor looked at her. "The drive you have," she said, "is not the only copy." The room stopped. Your father made one copy, Silas said. I've known the file's architecture since he built it. There is no duplicate. My father made one copy, Elena said. I made another. She paused. Last night, before I left the estate. She watched Victor's face. It's somewhere you won't find it before it becomes a problem. Victor looked at Silas. Silas looked back at Victor. In the exchange between them, she saw the thing she needed to see. The seam. The place where two men who'd built something together were suddenly uncertain of each other's version of the same information. Silas believed her. She could see it, the specific tension of a man recalculating. Victor wasn't sure, and that gap, that small divergence of certainty, was what the plan needed. Where? Victor said. Flat. Immediate. That depends on what happens to my brother in the next 5 minutes, Elena said. Victor looked at Milo. He looked back at Elena, and she watched him run the calculation in real time. Not emotional, just operational, the arithmetic of leverage. He moved to Milo and put his hand on the boy's shoulder. Milo went rigid. Elena kept her face where it was. Your brother walks out, Victor said, when I have every copy of that file and when Damien Viscari is standing in this room. He tightened his grip on Milo's shoulder. Not violent, just pointed. Those are the terms. They haven't changed. Damien is at the estate, Elena said. Then call him. He won't come for me, she said. It isn't that kind of marriage. Call him anyway, Victor said, and convince him. She took the phone the guard had returned to her. She found Damien's number. She pressed call, and while it rang, she looked at her brother's face, the bruise, the hospital bracelet, the furious and frightened eyes of a boy who was trying very hard to be braver than he was. And she held the look long enough for him to understand that she was not afraid, or at least that she was performing not being afraid well enough that the distinction didn't matter. Damien answered on the second ring. Elena. I'm at the waterfront, she said. The storage facility on Crane Street. A pause. Measured. I have the drive. Silas is here. Victor Salazar is here. She let her voice do the thing the plan required. Not full collapse, just the specific fraying of someone who had run out of road. Damien, they have Milo. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I didn't... She stopped. Started again. I need you to come. A silence on the other end. The silence of a man who was listening to something with 2 levels of attention. I'm coming, he said. His voice was exactly right, clipped and cold, the voice of a man who'd been handed a betrayal and was deciding how to respond to it. Don't do anything. The line went dead. Victor looked at her. She looked back. He's coming, she said. I know, Victor said. I could hear it in his voice. He released Milo's shoulder and moved back, and something in his posture changed. The particular change of a man shifting from pressure to patience, from forcing the hand to waiting for the cards to settle. He was good at this, she thought. He was very good at this, and the fact that she was in the same room with someone this good at this, with Milo standing 8 feet away with a bruise on his jaw, was something she needed to metabolize quickly and quietly, and not think about too directly. She thought about the secondary device in her shoe. She thought about 40 minutes of handwriting in the pre-dawn dark. She waited. Damien arrived in 11 minutes. She heard the vehicle first, one vehicle, which was wrong and right simultaneously. Wrong because she'd expected more, and right because more would have signaled what it was. One vehicle meant he'd come alone, or appeared to. The sound of the door, the entrance below, the footsteps on the metal stairs. And then he was in the room, and the room changed the way rooms changed when someone with that specific quality of presence entered them. Not dramatically, just measurably, the air pressure adjusting. He looked at Elena first. One look, fast, comprehensive. She kept her face showing the right things: guilt, relief, desperation. She was giving the performance of her life to the only person in the room who knew it was a performance, and the only way it worked was if he could read what was underneath it, and everyone else could only read the surface. He looked away from her. He looked at Victor. Salazar, he said. Viscari. Victor's tone had the particular warmth of an enemy who had been looking forward to a confrontation for a long time. Your wife made an interesting choice tonight. I can see that, Damien said. His voice was calibrated perfectly. Cold but not dead, the voice of a man containing something rather than a man who felt nothing. He looked at Silas, and what happened in his face when he looked at Silas was the only moment in the entire performance where Elena couldn't tell how much was real and how much was the plan. Because the thing that moved across his expression when he looked at the man who had been his consigliere for 20 years was so specific and so human that it would have taken a different kind of actor than either of them to manufacture it. "Damien," Silas said. His voice was very quiet. "Don't," Damien said. Just that. One word and the weight of 20 years in it. Silas was quiet. Victor moved and the room moved with him. His 3 men repositioning with the practiced synchronization of people who'd done this before. The geometry of the space reconfiguring around a new center of gravity. "Here is the situation," Victor said pleasantly. "I have the file. I have the boy. I have you in a room with more guns than you came with." He tilted his head. "I'm prepared to be reasonable. Transition your remaining operations to my oversight. Documented, legal, irrevocable. Sign the transfer tonight. The boy goes free. You go free. Elena goes free." He paused. "Silas handles the cleanup." "Cleanup," Elena noted. "Not the rest. Cleanup." She looked at Silas. He was looking at the floor. "That's not a deal," Damien said. "That's a surrender document." "That's correct," Victor said. "No," Damien said. The room went tight. Victor's pleasant expression held, but something behind it hardened. "You came here alone," he said. "You don't have a position to negotiate from." "I came here alone," Damien agreed. "That's what you see." A beat. "The recording started," Damien said. 40 seconds after I walked in this door. Everything said in this room for the last 11 minutes is on an encrypted channel that I don't control and can't stop." He let that land. Victor Salazar, Silas Moretti, on tape, in a room with a kidnapped minor discussing the murder of 2 federal informants 11 years ago. He paused. "That's what the secondary copy of the file is, Elena." He looked at her. "Not a drive. A live broadcast. Your father built the file to be transmittable. I just transmitted it." The secondary device in her shoe wasn't a locator. It was a transmitter. She hadn't known that. It hadn't been in the handwriting. He'd kept it back. Not because he didn't trust her, but because if she hadn't known, then she couldn't have given it away. And if she couldn't have given it away, then the plan had a layer that Silas's surveillance couldn't strip. She looked at Damien. He looked back. And in the fraction of a second of that exchange, she saw it. The thing she'd seen in the hospital waiting room when Dr. Okafor came through the doors. The shutter a second too slow. The opening beneath the control. Not apology. Trust. Absolute and unilateral. Victor's pleasant expression was gone. "You're bluffing," he said. "Check your phone," Damien said. "Someone is probably trying to reach you right now." Victor's hand moved to his jacket pocket. He stopped himself. He looked at Damien. He looked at Silas. And the seam that Elena had seen open between them in the first minutes widened now into something structural. 2 men who had built something together suddenly standing on opposite sides of a calculation that only had room for one of them. Silas moved first, not toward Damien, toward Victor. And Elena understood in the single second it took for Silas to cover the distance that she had miscalculated one thing. Not the plan, not the broadcast, not the drive. She'd miscalculated Silas's survival instinct, which was older and faster and more ruthless than anything else in the room. Silas hit Victor's guard on the left with the economical violence of a man who'd done this before he was managing anyone else's violence. Victor moved back, reaching for something at his waist, and then the room erupted. "Milo," Elena said. Not a shout. A flat, directed command. Milo dropped. "Milo." She crossed the room in 4 steps, staying below the line of the 2 guards who were now managing the sudden problem of their employer and his ally trying to kill each other. And she got to Milo and pulled him down further and put herself between him and the room and felt the physical reality of his weight against her. Real, warm, alive, with a ferocity of relief that she didn't have time to feel yet. "Door," she said in his ear. "There's a guy." "The guy is busy," she said. "Door, now." They moved along the wall. She kept low. Milo matched her pace with the adaptive speed of a kid who'd grown up being told to move when his sister said move. The interior door, the one Milo had come through, was 4 feet away. 3, 2. A body hit the table behind them. The laptop went off the edge. Someone shouted in a language she didn't identify. She got her hand on the door handle. She looked back for Damien. He was across the room, and Silas had a blade. A compact, practical blade that had come from somewhere on his body. The tool of a man who knew that guns jammed and rooms got complicated, and the oldest weapon was still often the most reliable. Silas had the blade, and he was moving, and Damien's gun was up, but the distance was wrong, too close for the angle, and she saw Damien calculate the problem in real time and come up one option short. Silas drove the blade into Damien's left side. She heard it, heard the impact, heard Damien's exhaled breath, saw him go into the wall. Silas stepped back. His face was back to the warmth, the practiced warmth, which was the most horrifying thing she'd ever seen on a human face. "The broadcast doesn't matter," Silas said to Damien. "Dead men don't testify." He raised the blade. Elena was already moving. She didn't decide. Her body decided. The same body that had been running calculations since the hospital corridor and the car window and the poisoned tea. The body that had been building toward this specific moment for weeks without knowing what shape it would take. She crossed the room with Milo's voice behind her saying her name, and she hit Silas from the side. Not with any technique, just with all the weight and momentum and accumulated fury of a woman who had buried her parents without a body and spent 10 years carrying a secret she didn't know she was carrying and had spent the last weeks watching the man who killed them perform warmth in her husband's house. Silas stumbled. The blade went wide. Damien's hand closed around Silas's wrist. She heard the specific sound of a wrist being forced past the point it was designed to go. And then the blade was on the floor, and then Damien had Silas against the wall with one forearm and his other hand pressed to his own left side where the blood was coming through his shirt in a dark and spreading stain that she looked at and then looked away from because she couldn't look at it and function simultaneously. "Don't," Damien said to Silas, quietly. The same word he'd said before, with the same weight. Silas stopped struggling. Across the room, Victor had a gun. He had it leveled. His 3 men were arrayed behind him, and 2 of them also had weapons, and the calculus of the room had just tipped in a direction that the plan had not accounted for, because the plan had assumed a faster resolution, and the resolution had not been fast. "Let him go," Victor said, directed at Damien. His voice was different now. Not pleasant, not controlled, stripped down to the arithmetic. Damien's arm was shaking slightly. Elena could see it from where she was standing. The specific tremor of a body trying to maintain a demand that an injury was making increasingly difficult to meet. "Damien," she said. He didn't look at her. "Damien." She moved toward him. Victor's gun tracked her and she stopped. "Stay where you are," Victor said. She looked at Victor. She looked at the gun. She looked at the 3 men behind him. She looked at Milo in the doorway, 12 years old with a hospital bracelet on his wrist and a bruise on his jaw, watching his sister in the middle of a room with 3 guns in it. She looked at the floor. The blade was 4 feet from her right foot. She looked at Victor. "The broadcast is real," she said. "I know you know it's real because your phone has been going off for the last 4 minutes and you haven't answered it." She held his gaze. "Law enforcement is already moving. This building is going to be surrounded in—" She checked her watch, the physical action of checking it, deliberate and visible. "Less than 8 minutes. You can spend those 8 minutes here, or you can spend them getting out." She paused. "Silas is not going to be a problem for you anymore. Damien is injured. I'm one person. You have what you need to run." She let that settle. "Or you can stay and get 8 more minutes of evidence on the broadcast." Victor looked at her. He was good at reading people. She knew he was good at reading people. She was betting everything she had left on the specific gamble that a man who was good at reading people, in a room with a live broadcast running and law enforcement en route, would make the rational choice. He made it. One word to his men. They moved. Victor moved with them. The door to the stairs opened, and she heard them going down, and then the exterior, and then the vehicles, and then the particular quality of silence that comes after something loud has left. She went to Damien. He was still holding Silas against the wall, but the arm was shaking harder now, and his face had the gray-white tone of someone whose body was submitting a formal complaint that the brain was overriding. She put her hand over his against the wall and looked at Silas, and Silas looked back at her with the eyes of a man who had run every calculation and found the end of the column. "Sit down," she said to Silas. "On the floor, don't move." He sat. She turned to Damien. He let her take the weight. Not all of it. He was still upright, still himself in the fundamental way he was always himself. But he let her take the arm over her shoulder and some of the balance, and she felt the warmth of blood through his shirt against her hand. "I'm fine," he said. "You're not," she said, "relatively." "Stop talking," she said. "Elena, Milo, come here," she said, and her brother crossed the room to her, and she looked at his face for one full second, the bruise, the bracelet, the eyes, and then she turned him toward the stairs. "Go outside. There will be people outside. Tell them your name and tell them which room." "What about you?" "Go, Milo." He went. She turned back to Damien. He was looking at her with an expression that had nothing maintained about it. No shudder, no management, just the face underneath everything, the one she'd been catching in fragments for weeks. "The transmitter," she said. "I needed a layer you couldn't give away," he said. "I know." She tightened her arm around him. "I know. Are you angry?" She thought about it for a second, legitimately. "Ask me later," she said, "when you're not bleeding on me." Something happened at the corners of his mouth. "Bear!" She got him toward the stairs. Behind them, Silas sat on the floor of the room with the overturned laptop and the blood on the wall, and 11 years of a long game finally arriving at its terminus. And he did not try to move, because there was nowhere left to move to. Outside, the first vehicles were already visible at the end of Crane Street. Not Victor's, not Damien's, but the kind with lights on them, moving fast through the early gray of a morning that was finally, incrementally, getting lighter. Milo was on the sidewalk. He turned when he heard them come out, and he looked at Elena, and then he looked at Damien, and then he looked at his sister again with the particular expression of a 12-year-old who has just processed a great deal of information and arrived at a conclusion he intended to have thoughts about later. "You're bleeding," he said to Damien. "Observant kid," Damien said. "Elena says I am," Milo said. "She's right about most things," Damien said. Elena looked at the approaching vehicles. She looked at the building behind them, at the windows of the second floor where everything had just happened. She looked at her brother standing on a waterfront at 6 in the morning in his hospital bracelet. She looked at the man leaning against her shoulder with blood on his shirt and something in his expression that she was finally, slowly finding the word for. She was still holding the word in her chest, turning it over, when the first vehicle stopped in front of them and the doors opened and everything that came next began its own, different kind of unraveling. Slower, procedural, the machinery of consequence doing what machinery did. But the room was behind them. The blade was on the floor inside it, and Silas Moretti was sitting in the wreckage of 11 years of carefully maintained betrayal, waiting for the people with lights on their vehicles to come and find him there. The hospital was different the second time. The first time she'd sat in a waiting room with Damien, it had been about Milo. 7 hours of fluorescent light and vending machine coffee, and a man she barely knew choosing to stay when he could have left. This time it was Damien on the table, and Milo sitting next to her in a plastic chair with his hospital bracelet still on his wrist. And the waiting had a different texture to it, heavier, more personal in a way that she hadn't caught up to yet. She sat with her hands in her lap and her jacket still carrying the smell of that building, machine oil, river damp, blood. And she did not move for the first hour. Milo sat beside her and didn't talk, which was unusual enough that she glanced at him twice to confirm he was still conscious. He was. He was just doing the things she sometimes forgot he was capable of, being still, reading the room, understanding that certain moments required quiet. The third time she glanced at him, he said, without looking up from the floor, "He's going to be okay." "I know," she said. "You don't know. You're hoping." She looked at him. He was looking at his bracelet, turning it on his wrist. "When did you get so literal?" she said. "Hospital does things to you," he said. Then, "He held my hand." She stilled. "What?" "When they brought me in, before you got there." Milo's voice was flat, in the way voices got flat when they were carrying something that didn't have a shape yet. I was scared, and he He held my hand for like 30 seconds and didn't say anything, and it helped. He paused. I didn't think it would, but it did. Elena looked at the far wall. She breathed in through her nose. Promise Dad, she said, to look after us. Milo was quiet for a moment. Did he know Dad? Yes. Well, he turned the bracelet again. He's pretty good at keeping promises. She put her arm around him, and he leaned into it with the particular and unselfconscious weight of a kid who was tired and had decided, for the moment, to stop managing how tired he was. She held him there and looked at the doors and waited. The blade had gone into Damien's left side between the fourth and fifth ribs, deep enough to cause significant bleeding, not deep enough to reach anything immediately fatal, which the surgeon described with the detached precision of someone who dealt in these distinctions daily. They kept him for surgery, and then recovery, and then observation, and by the time Elena was allowed into his room, it was past noon and the sun was coming through the window at an angle that made the whole room look more peaceable than it had any right to. He was awake, pale and reduced and connected to things, but awake. He looked at her when she came in, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, which had become, she realized, one of their functional languages. The silence they spoke when words would be approximate. Milo, he said, he's fine. He's in the waiting room eating a sandwich and arguing with the nurse about whether he's required to change back into a patient gown. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. He's going to be fine. Damien nodded. His eyes closed briefly and then opened again, the specific blink of someone fighting the sedative weight at the edge of consciousness. Victor. 3 federal agencies are looking for him. The broadcast covered enough that the warrant package was straightforward. She paused. He'll run for a while. He's good at running, but the financial network is gone. Your father's file had enough on the international accounts to freeze everything within 6 hours of the transmission. She looked at him. He's running with nothing. That's a different kind of running. He'll surface, Damien said. Yes, she said, and when he does, there will be people waiting. She held his gaze. Not your people, other people, people whose job it is. He looked at her. Something moved in his expression that she was learning to read. Not agreement, exactly. More like a man adjusting his weight on ground that had shifted. Silas, he said. She'd been saving this one. In custody, he talked within the first 2 hours. Apparently the prospect of what happens to men like him in federal detention was motivating. She paused. He gave up everything. The network, the politicians, the financiers, the connection to your parents' case, everything your father documented, plus the parts your father hadn't gotten to yet. She watched Damien's face. He gave up 20 years of organized operation to reduce his own exposure. Which means by the time the legal process runs its course, the structure your father spent 4 years trying to dismantle is going to be genuinely dismantled. Damien was very still. Your father's name, she said carefully, is going to be in the federal record as the originating source of the intelligence. Not a criminal, not a casualty. An informant who gathered evidence at the cost of his life. She paused. Both your parents. The record will be accurate. She watched something happen in his face that she had no name for and didn't try to name. It passed through him the way things pass through landscapes, visibly, completely, and leaving the terrain changed without making a sound. Thank you, he said, very quietly. I didn't do it, she said. Your lawyers did. I just told them what we needed. You knew what we needed, he said. There's a difference. She looked down at her hands. They were clean now. She'd washed them 3 times in the hospital bathroom, but she could still feel the texture of the morning on them, the wall, the door frame, the weight of his arm over her shoulder. I know what we needed, she agreed. The room was quiet for a while. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, moving through its own requirements, indifferent and relentless, the particular cruelty of ordinary life continuing adjacent to extraordinary events. The transmitter, Elena said. Elena. I'm not angry, she said. I told you to ask me later. It's later. She looked at him. I'm not angry, but I need to know why you kept it back. He was quiet for a moment. Because if you'd known the full plan, he said, you would have been performing knowledge, and Victor would have read it. He's very good at reading people. He held her gaze. I needed you to go into that room believing the plan was what I'd written on the notepad, so that your performance of believing it was accurate. You used my ignorance, she said. Yes. As a weapon. Yes. She sat with that. And if it had gone wrong? It didn't. But if it had, he didn't look away from her. Then I would have been wrong, he said, and it would have been my fault. And I was prepared to accept that. A pause. I wasn't prepared to accept the alternative, which was giving Silas one more layer of the plan to work with. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the notepad, the ashtray, the ash. She thought about a plan built in handwriting between two people in the dark, and one of them keeping a single room of it locked. She thought about trust, the actual texture of it, not the idea of it, the specific and difficult thing it was when it required you to operate on incomplete information and believe in the person holding the rest. She thought about her father's journal. He trusted me with everything that mattered. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, Kay? She stood up. She adjusted the blanket at the edge of the bed, a small domestic gesture that arrived without her planning it, and that she noticed arriving, and that she decided not to take back. Get some sleep. Milo is going to want to visit, and he will absolutely ask you to explain the entire plot of whatever novel he's currently reading. I don't mind, Damien said. She looked at him. He looked back. The shutter was fully open. She understood now that the shutter only closed in rooms with other people in them, that this, the open version, was the face he showed when they were alone, and that she had become, without negotiating for it, the person he showed it to. I know you don't, she said. Sleep anyway. She left him in the afternoon light. 3 weeks passed in the specific way that aftermath passed, slowly at the surface, fast underneath, the world reorganizing itself while ordinary time maintained its indifferent pace. Milo moved back to his room at the estate, which he approached with the methodical enthusiasm of someone taking formal possession of a space he'd decided he liked. He chose the room on the 3rd floor with the window that faced east, moved his books in 3 trips, and by the end of the first week had covered the desk with a rotating exhibit of science fiction paperbacks and hand-drawn star maps that he taped to the wall with the confidence of someone who'd decided the wall was now his wall. Elena watched this happen from the doorway one evening and felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt since she was small enough to believe that settling was a thing that happened, that you got to a place and stayed in it and it became yours. She went downstairs and found Ren in the kitchen. He's redecorating the east room, she said. I noticed, Ren said. He handed her a cup of tea without being asked. Should I be concerned? About the star maps? About the structural integrity of the plaster? Tape, she said. He used tape. She paused. He'll probably upgrade to push pins within the month. Ren looked at her with the expression of a man who had managed a household for 20 years and had developed opinions about the difference between a house and a home. I'll get push pins, he said. She took her tea and went out to the garden. Damien came home on a Thursday, 2.5 weeks after the waterfront. He walked in under his own power, which he'd been very specific about. She'd offered the car to the door. He'd said no, he'd walk from the gate, and she'd looked at the quarter-mile driveway and said something non-committal and had the car waiting at the gate anyway. He looked at the car and looked at her and got in without comment. The estate received him the way estates received the people who belonged to them, without ceremony, just the ordinary geometry of return. Ren in the entrance hall, the smell of the kitchen, Milo appearing at the top of the stairs and looking down with the evaluating expression of a 12-year-old sizing up a situation. You look bad, Milo told Damien. Milo, Elena said. He said I could be honest, Milo said. He specifically said that. I have a witness. He pointed at Ren, who was very carefully looking at the middle distance. I do look bad, Damien said. I'll look less bad next week. Does it hurt? Yes. Okay, Milo said, apparently satisfied with the directness of this. He came down the stairs. I finished the book, the one I was telling you about. Do you want to know what happens? After dinner, Damien said. After dinner, Milo agreed and went back upstairs. Damien stood in the entrance hall and looked around at the house, the particular look of a man re-inhabiting a space he'd been away from and finding it different in ways he couldn't immediately catalog. Elena watched him look. It's the same, she said. No, it isn't, he said. He was right. It wasn't the same. Star maps on the third floor, 2 coffee cups instead of 1 in the kitchen every morning, her books in the library beside his, a dog-eared cartography text that she'd finally actually read, placed back on the shelf at a slightly different angle than it had been in someone else's careful hiding system, because it was just a book now. It was just a book again. She walked him to the study, slowly, because the walk from the gate had cost him, and he wasn't going to say so. And he sat down in his chair, and she brought him water, and he took it without any performance about not needing it. The legal team needs you to review the transfer documents this week, she said. The first tranche of the business conversions is ready. How many? 6. The warehousing operations, the import-export licenses, the property management shell. They're folding into legitimate LLCs with real governance structures. She paused. The lawyers say the framework is clean. It'll take 2 years to complete, he said. The lawyers say 18 months if we move efficiently. He looked at her. We. She held his gaze. I've been sitting in on the meetings, she said. While you were in the hospital, Ren thought I should. She paused. I thought Ren was right. Something shifted in his expression, not surprise, something more layered than surprise. You didn't have to do that. I know, she said. I did it anyway. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the documents she'd placed on the desk. Real documents, legal documents, the paperwork of a man dismantling something that had taken decades to build and choosing to do it one clean transfer at a time. She'd read all of it. She'd asked questions of the lawyers that they'd answered with the particular attentiveness people gave to questions that indicated genuine understanding. There's something I need to tell you, Damien said. She waited. Before the marriage, he said, in the first meeting, when I told you I needed a wife and that you were specifically who I wanted. He paused. I told you the reason was operational. I remember. It was, he said, partially. He looked at his hands. Your father described you to me in the early months when we were still in contact. In the journal entries you didn't read because they were earlier than the ones you found. He stopped. Started again with the particular care of a man navigating something fragile that he didn't want to handle carelessly. He said you were the most capable person he'd ever known. He said you were going to have a harder life than you deserved because you were too honest for the world that was coming for you. He looked up at her. I read that 11 years ago. I never forgot it. Elena was very still. When I found out about Milo's condition, he said, and that you were exhausting every option, I could have sent money anonymously. I could have arranged the surgery without contact. My lawyers could have structured it through a medical foundation that would have been invisible. He held her gaze. I didn't do that. Why? She said. Because I wanted to meet you, he said. Because your father said you were remarkable, and I had spent 11 years knowing I'd failed the man who said that, and I wanted... He stopped. The word underneath was visible in the pause, the thing he was working up to. I wanted to know if he was right. The room was absolutely quiet. Was he? She said. Something happened in Damien's face that she'd spent weeks building toward seeing, the complete version of the thing she'd been catching in fragments. Not the shutter open, the shutter gone. Yes, he said, simply, without decoration. He was right. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a matchbook in a diner, and a hospital corridor that smelled like bleach, and a plastic chair outside room 14C, and a man she'd thought was a monster sitting across a conference table, telling her the truth in a language that had taken her weeks to learn to speak. She thought about her father's voice, which she could barely remember now, the specific timbre of it gone soft with time, and what it might have sounded like saying her name to a man he trusted in the months before the silence. She thought about trust, the actual thing it was. the specific and ongoing and non-theoretical act of it. My father had good judgment, she said. He did, Damien said, about most things. Most things, he agreed. She moved to the desk and sat on the edge of it, which put her closer to him, and she looked at the transfer document spread between them, pages and pages of the architecture of change, a man taking apart what he'd built and building something else in its place, one documented decision at a time. Tell me about the warehousing transfer, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the first document. The primary holding is structured as a limited liability. I know what it's structured as, she said. Tell me the parts the lawyers aren't sure about. He looked at her again. And then, for the first time in the months she'd known him, Damien Viscari laughed. Not a performance, not a social gesture, just a brief and genuine sound that arrived and left quickly, the way real things arrived and left, without preamble and without apology. Page 7, he said. There's a clause. She took the document. She read page 7. This is a problem, she said. I know. You need a different holding structure for the legacy contracts, or you're going to trigger a reporting requirement that will... I know, he said. That's why it's on page 7 and not page 1. I've been thinking about it for 2 weeks. I have a thought about it, she said. Tell me. She told him. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without fidgeting, all the way through. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the page. That's better than anything the lawyers suggested, he said. The lawyers are thinking about legal exposure, she said. I'm thinking about operational continuity. She put the page down. Different problem. He looked at her. The expression on his face was the full and unmaintained one, the one she'd decided was his real face. The face her father had apparently seen clearly enough to describe to a stranger with sufficient accuracy that the stranger had spent 11 years holding the description. Elena, he said. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. Not tonight. There's too much paperwork. His mouth moved at the corner. Tomorrow. Ask me tomorrow, she said. Will the answer be different tomorrow? She thought about it. No, she said. But I'd like to sleep on it anyway. He nodded. She stood up from the desk. She picked up the document stack and squared the edges against the desk surface, the small and automatic gesture of a person who straightened things before leaving rooms. She moved toward the door. Elena, she turned. Your father was right about something else, Damien said. He said if you ever decided to trust someone, you would trust them completely, and it would be the most terrifying thing that person had ever been given. She looked at him. The lamplight was the same as it had always been in this room, warm and wrong for difficult conversations, but she'd stopped noticing that. She'd stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the peculiarities of places that had become yours. He wasn't wrong, she said. She went upstairs. Go on. Milo was in the hallway outside his room with a paperback and his reading light clipped to the doorframe, which was a system he'd developed for reading after the household officially went quiet. He looked up when she came up the stairs, and she gave him the look she'd been giving him since he was 4 years old. The one that meant she saw him. The one that meant she knew exactly what he was doing. The one that meant she wasn't going to make it into a thing. He held up the book. 5 more chapters, he said. 2, she said. 4. 3, she said. And then sleep. Real sleep, not reading under the blanket with your phone flashlight. He made the face. Then he went inside. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the house. It was a particular sound, the estate at night, breathing through its own 3 stories of history. The hum of the heating, a window somewhere settling. The small and domestic sounds of a building that had been built for one kind of life and was being quietly renegotiated into another. She thought about what that took, the renegotiation, the specific courage required to take something that had been built for a purpose and say, not this anymore, something else now, something worth more. She went to her room. She washed her face. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and held the day in her hands for a moment, the weight of it, the texture of it. The way it connected back through all the other days to a hospital corridor and a matchbook and a plastic chair and a number on a piece of paper that had once felt like the shape of the word impossible. The number was paid. Milo was 3 doors down, reading past his allotment, which she knew and would address tomorrow with the mild and performative severity of someone who wasn't actually going to address it seriously. The man who had promised her father something in the dark 11 years ago was downstairs, reading page 7 of a legal document with a clause he already knew was a problem. She lay down. She pulled the blanket up. She thought about her father describing her to a stranger. Capable, honest, harder life than she deserved. She thought about a stranger reading those words and keeping them for 11 years like an object, something to hold the shape of, something to move toward. She thought about what it meant that the only person who'd ever known her father's estimate of her was the man she'd thought was a monster. She thought about trust, the non-theoretical, ongoing, specific act of it. She was still holding the thought when she fell asleep, which was the first time in months she'd fallen asleep still holding something instead of putting it down because she couldn't afford to carry it into unconsciousness. In the morning, she came downstairs at 6 and found Damien already at the kitchen table with coffee and the page 7 document and a notepad that had 7 lines of annotations on it. He looked up when she came in. She looked at the notepad. 8, she said. There's an 8th issue. I found it at 4 in the morning, he said. It's at the bottom. She crossed to the coffee machine. She made coffee the way she'd learned to make it in this kitchen. Their system, built over weeks, without anyone deciding to build it. She brought 2 cups to the table and sat down and picked up the notepad. The 8th issue is actually connected to the 3rd, she said. I know, he said. If you resolve the 3rd, the 8th resolves itself. I know, he said. That's what I've been working on. She looked at his annotations. She added one of her own to the bottom of the list. He read it. He looked at her. That's it, he said. I know, she said. They sat at the kitchen table in the early morning light with the paperwork of a renegotiated life spread between them, and through the window the grounds were the particular silver gray of pre-dawn, the iron fence at the perimeter just visible, the tree line beyond it dark and still. A guard making the circuit, same as always, the city somewhere beyond the trees doing what cities did. Milo appeared at the kitchen door at 6:30 in his socks and yesterday's clothes, which told her he'd fallen asleep at his desk again. He looked at both of them at the table with the documents between them and the 2 coffee cups and the notepad covered in combined handwriting, and his face did the thing it did when he was processing something he was going to store rather than comment on immediately. Is there breakfast? He said. Ren leaves bread and eggs, Elena said. You know where the pan is. Can he make eggs? Milo said, with the pragmatic directness of a 12-year-old who had identified the most efficient path to breakfast. Damien looked at Milo. Yes, he said. Good, Milo said. I like them scrambled, not too wet. Noted, Damien said. He stood up, carefully, the left side still requiring a certain amount of care about how he distributed his weight, and crossed to the stove. Elena watched him find the pan, find the eggs, open the refrigerator with the particular efficiency of a man mapping a space he was committing to rather than visiting. She picked up the notepad. She read through the annotations. His 7 and her 1. Different handwriting, different angle, same problem from 2 directions. She thought about her father's file, the years it had taken to build it. The evidence gathered one thread at a time by a man who believed that the structure could be changed if you were patient enough and honest enough and willing enough to pay the cost of the belief. She thought about what it said about her father, that he'd believed that in a world that was organized around the principle that certain structures were permanent, that they'd been there before you, and they'd be there after you. And the only real question was which side of them you ended up on. Her father had believed there was a 3rd option. She looked at Damien at the stove, scrambling eggs for a 12-year-old in a kitchen in an estate that was in the process of becoming something it had never been before. She looked at Milo at the table, building a stack of toast with the architectural seriousness of someone who intended to eat all of it. She looked at the notepad in her hands. 8 problems and an emerging solution, the specific and unglamorous work of changing something real. She thought her father had been right about the 3rd option. She thought maybe he'd been right about most things. Outside the kitchen window, the sky was beginning to go from gray to the particular pale gold of early morning. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just the incremental lightning that happened every day without ceremony. The sky doing what skies did regardless of what had happened in the dark before it. The grounds emerged from the gray. The fence? The tree line? The city somewhere beyond it, waking up into a morning that didn't know what had changed in it overnight and wouldn't know for months, maybe years. When the legal processes ran their course and the documents filed themselves and the names in her father's file became the names in other documents, public documents, the kind that got archived and cited and eventually taught. Thomas and Margaret Cross. The names that would be in those documents, accurate, finally. What they were, not what had been convenient to say they were. Elena set the notepad down. She picked up her coffee. She looked at her brother and her husband and the window and the morning, and she did not name what she felt. Not because she didn't have the word, but because some things were more themselves unnamed, held in the chest as what they were before language got to them and made them smaller. She held it there. The eggs were ready. Milo ate with the focused intensity of a 12-year-old who had, against all probability, made it through to the other side of something that should have been unsurvivable and was now primarily interested in breakfast. Damien sat back down across from her and picked up his coffee. The document between them, with its 8 problems and its emerging solution, waited with the patience of paperwork. "Page 7, Elena said. "Page 7, Damien agreed. She picked up the pen. She started writing.